establishing central influence immediately, preparing for pawn advancements and piece development toward the monarch's safety. Establishing central influence and preparing for a flexible pawn structure, this knight outpost offers immediate counterplay. Unveiling a pawn-grabbing threat, this bishop immediately pins the knight, influencing central control and preparing for potential pawn advances. Challenging white's central grip directly, this pawn push asserts queenside presence while opening diagonals. Sacrificing the bishop opens a critical diagonal for the queen, creating immediate pressure. Sacrificing pawn structure for central influence creates an unbalanced game. Black must now activate pieces harmoniously. Opening the e-file for the queen, white solidifies the center and prepares development, creating a slight pawn weakness for black's king. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure after the recapture blunder is the immediate priority, though it opens lines later. Challenging the pawn chain now opens lines and fights for the center's breadth. Sacrificing a pawn opens lines for your pieces, but watch for white's central space advantage. Recapturing with the bishop immediately reclaims a central pawn, offering white a slight space advantage and opening lines for their pieces. This exchange, however, creates doubled pawns for black on the f-file, a potential weakness that could be exploited later. White now has a comfortable pawn structure and can focus on developing their remaining pieces, aiming for piece activity and control of key squares. The game is transitioning into a more positional struggle. Developing the bishop to g7 offers a powerful diagonal and prepares for castling, reinforcing the kingside's defensive structure against potential pawn pushes. Developing a piece to its natural square, the knight now eyes the central tension and prepares to support a potential queenside expansion, aiming to solidify white's space advantage and create multiple avenues for future action. Securely tucking the monarch away in the corner is a sensible priority now, especially after the pawn structure has been so dramatically altered, creating a small pocket of relative safety while white's pieces are still developing and haven't yet gained an imposing presence on the queenside. Aggressively pushing the kingside pawn aims to disrupt black's nascent pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the castled king, but it comes at the cost of weakening white's own king's safety and potentially sacrificing valuable tempo. Unlocking the queenside with a pawn push that challenges the central pawn structure. Abandoning the central pawn opens a diagonal for your bishop, potentially unleashing it towards black's queenside while simultaneously clearing the d-file for your rooks. However, it concedes essential space and allows black to solidify their pawn structure, potentially leading to a cramped position for white if not managed proactively. The queen's active placement immediately threatens the pawn on c5 and aims to disrupt white's central control, forcing a decision about the newly created pawn structure. Asserting command of the open c-file with the rook establishes a powerful central presence and prepares to exploit the pawn deficit black faces, aiming to pry open lines towards the king. A knight emerges from its shell, eyeing the queenside and preparing to contest the central pawn structure, a subtle but important rebalancing act after the earlier skirmishes. Pushing that pawn forward initiates a direct confrontation on the kingside, aiming to pry open lines before black can solidify. Seizing the initiative on the kingside, this knight hop immediately creates significant tactical possibilities, threatening to fork the white queen and rook and disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain. Clearing the bishop's path toward the queenside now creates a potent attacking spearhead, aiming to disrupt black's castled position and capitalize on the weakened pawn structure around the king. Opening the d-file for the rook presents a dual-edged opportunity, potentially unlocking attacking chances on the queenside, but also leaving the king slightly more exposed should white manage to penetrate. Opening the h-file creates immediate pressure on black's castled position, potentially exposing the king to future attacks, especially with the bishop on d5 eyeing the queenside. Opening up that h-file is a bold commitment, transforming your pawn structure into a series of inviting targets along the kingside, but it grants your queen excellent mobility and opens the door for potential counterplay down the center. A subtle repositioning of the knight aims to activate the king side and potentially pressure black's slightly exposed king by clearing the f3 square for other pieces. Challenging the pinned knight directly aims to unravel white's kingside presence and potentially free up black's queenside pieces, though it does invite further pawn structure complications. Shifting the king offers a safer haven from potential pawn storm assaults and prepares for a more centralized defensive setup. Snatching the pawn on c5 creates an immediate imbalance, opening lines for the queen but potentially leaving the pawn structure somewhat fragmented long-term. Unlocking the c-file suddenly injects dynamism into white's position, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed king and potential weaknesses along the diagonal. A bold repositioning of the queen, aiming to establish an immediate threat along the open queenside file while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay involving the knight. Sacrificing the knight opens up the f-file for your queen and creates immediate pressure on black's compromised kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position considerably, shifting the focus to white's doubled pawns on the f-file and the open c-file for black's rook, creating immediate territorial advantages. The pawn structure has undergone a radical transformation. This recapture consolidates white's newly acquired queenside majority, setting the stage for a protracted positional battle where the open f-file will become a crucial theater of operations for white's rook, aiming to infiltrate black's territory. Re-establishing a pawn chain on the kingside offers black a chance to consolidate their central presence and potentially initiate counterplay, though it does create a slight backwardness on the e-file that requires careful handling. The rook slides to the open file, aiming to exploit the central pawn structure that has just been simplified and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside while coordinating with the other rook. The bishop tucks itself away, creating a subtle threat along the a2-g8 diagonal. But more importantly, it establishes a defensive guard for the vulnerable kingside pawns. Focusing attention on the queenside, this rook maneuver aims to secure control of the open b-file and potentially pressure black's weakened pawn structure there. Discovering a square for that bishop, pinning the knight and gaining tempo forces a response, disrupting white's rook coordination and creating immediate tactical possibilities in the center. Securing the king's escape route while preparing a potential knight sortie to the queenside is the immediate strategic aim here, aiming to avoid being pinned and improve piece coordination under pressure. Suddenly, the pawn advances, a bold thrust into enemy territory, aiming to seize breathing room and disrupt the opponent's central control. Capturing the central pawn dramatically alters the board's landscape, opening the file for potential pressure and forcing a fundamental reevaluation of black's pawn structure. Seizing the open file with the rook establishes immediate pressure, forcing white to react and potentially create weaknesses in their own structure as they scramble to defend. Reclaiming the open file after the queen exchange is a logical step to activate the rook, aiming to control the file and potentially pressure black's structure down that side of the board. This rook repositioning, while active, does leave the d-file somewhat less contested by white's pieces currently. Black might look to exploit that imbalance later. The move subtly prepares for potential kingside play if black commits their pieces too passively, or it could serve as a defensive measure against black's own rook aiming for the queenside. It's an attempt to create imbalances and active counterplay when the material is reduced, forcing black to find precise defensive resources. Consider the dynamic potential this opens up. The rook on the flank can become a powerful attacking instrument. Pressing the queenside, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's rook, creating immediate practical problems and threatening to unravel the awkward pawn structure white has allowed. It aims to exploit the open b-file and potentially develop a central outpost for black's knights. Snatching the rook decisively clears the kingside pressure for white and simplifies into a winning material advantage, though black's advanced pawns now pose a unique long-term challenge. Capturing the rook opens a critical diagonal for the bishop, but at the cost of sacrificing the pawn's structural integrity on the queenside, and allowing white to establish a powerful outpost with their knight. A bold gamble to simplify, sacrificing the bishop's outpost for an immediately open file that might become critical if black hesitates. Black's decision to capture the pawn on b3, though seemingly straightforward, opens up a fascinating endgame scenario by completely eliminating white's queenside pawn majority and creating a passed pawn for itself on the file. This pawn push, while immediate, might be better appreciated as a strategic commitment to a dynamic pawn structure where black now possesses the initiative to advance its own central and queenside pawns, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated pieces and exploit the open a file for potential infiltration, even if it means accepting a slightly less robust kingside pawn shield for the time being. Opening the queenside further, this knight leap aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the newly created diagonal for its advanced pieces. Unleashing a bolt of counterplay, black boldly repositions the bishop to harass the rook and simultaneously offers a dynamic sacrifice of material to disrupt white's newfound advantage. A bold repositioning, the bishop retreats to a safe haven, relinquishing a precarious outskirt to fortify the central structure and prepare for potential pawn advances. Opening up lines for the bishop to pressure the now exposed white king is a crucial objective here, even if it momentarily surrenders the central pawn. The bishop's repositioning to d1 seems to be an attempt to retreat from the active c2 square, perhaps anticipating a future skirmish along the d-file, while simultaneously preparing to defend the b2 pawn, which currently lacks pawn support and is vulnerable after the exchange of queens and rook activity. This is a bold attempt to disrupt the king's shelter, sacrificing material for potential tactical chaos and aiming to expose the opponent's monarch before it can consolidate. Re-establishing kingside safety and centralizing the monarch after the forced exchange of queens offers a degree of positional stability. Unleashing the rook to skewer the king and seize an open line, this maneuver instantly injects vital activity into black's position, aiming to disrupt white's currently consolidated, but rather passive setup and forcing a decision.